Japan Station is made possible in part by Patreon support, and I'd like to say thank you to Carl Revilla, who is our newest patron. He joined at the $3 a month plus alpha tier. That gives him access to Japanese Plus Alpha, a podcast that I do about the Japanese language and its various quirks. There's a lot of interesting stuff that I include in that podcast that I don't really talk about anywhere else. So if you want to find out what that's all about, go sign up at japankyo.com/Patreon. And by the way, you can also sign up for as little as $1 a month. That comes with early access to episodes and versions of these episodes without this long intro. So if you can afford to do so, I would certainly appreciate it. But otherwise, enjoy the episode. And once again, thank you to Carl. Welcome to a bonus solo episode of Japan Station. My name is Tony Vega. And of course, on the standard, regular, normal episodes of Japan Station, I interview people about Japan and their connections to Japan. But on this episode, I'm going to do something a little bit different. It's going to be a solo episode, and I'm going to be answering a question by a listener. And it's not just any listener, actually. It's a patron, Nicholas Andriani. Thank you so much for joining the Patreon, Nicholas. It's been wonderful talking to you. And thank you so much for this question. This really got me thinking. And in fact, it got me thinking so much that I thought maybe I should try answering this in podcast form rather than just written form. So anyway, here goes. Nicholas asked me, how did you become so familiar with Japan? Any books, films, content you can recommend to a Japanese studies major? First of all, I just want to say thank you for that very flattering question, Nicholas. Maybe I should say here too that I'm not just doing this episode in order to kind of brag about myself. I am confident in my abilities in the Japanese language. I do think that I have a solid and broad understanding of Japan and the Japanese language, but I totally acknowledge that there are plenty of other people that have just, at the very least, the same amount of knowledge about Japan that I do, if not way more, and I've talked to at least a few of them on this show. So, with that understanding, we're going to try to dive a little deeper into this. Now, yes, I'm very familiar with Japan. I mean, I've been learning about Japan or studying the Japanese language in some way or another for over 20 years. My major in college was Asian studies. I studied Japanese language almost every semester. I studied abroad. I also did religious studies, which focused quite a bit on Asian religions and Japanese religions as well. And then I went to Japan for 3 years on the JET program, and I went back to Florida, and then I came to Hawaii, where I spent 2 years here at the University of Hawaii getting a master's degree in Japanese language and linguistics. And for the past few years, I've been working at a company where just about every single person, or I think at the present moment, every single person is Japanese, and I still speak Japanese on a daily basis. And I do this show and Ichimon Japan where I'm constantly doing research about Japan. I'm reading books about Japan, and I'm consuming Japanese content just for the heck of it, just because I enjoy consuming Japanese content. So yeah, I am very much connected with Japan. I also occasionally still write articles about Japan. I keep an eye on the news. So yeah, anyway, I'm connected to Japan. I have a solid expertise, solid understanding of Japan. So why did I go through that entire little summary there? Because I just want to make it very clear that what I know about Japan, my knowledge about Japan, did not happen overnight. It happened over a very long time, and I am still learning to this very day. Every single time that I interview someone on Japan Station, I do tons of research so that I know, well, one, I know enough about the topic that I can have a conversation that you, the listener, would enjoy listening to, right? If I know nothing about the topic, I mean, I think that a lot of times that will end up in a rather shallow conversation that won't really interest that many people, right? Like if you don't know the right questions to ask, you're not going to get the interesting answers. Now, there are exceptions to that where maybe I just don't know a lot, and so I end up asking some rather general questions, but that ends up being very interesting because maybe it's a topic that most people don't know about, or for whatever reason, maybe the person that I'm interviewing is just a really, really interesting speaker and they can make anything interesting. But, there's always exceptions. But for the most part, I think that an interviewer should be pretty familiar with the topic that they're discussing in order to get the most out of the conversation. So going back to what I was saying, though, is that, I've read so many books just for this podcast alone. Now, for Ichimon Japan, I've spent so many hours doing research on all kinds of Japan-related things, right? Now, that's mainly stuff on the internet, news articles, sometimes academic articles. I've also read books specifically for certain topics. So I've spent hours and hours and hours doing research in English and Japanese. Now, I've also spent many hours doing research in English and Japanese for my job, where I work as the editor-in-chief of Wasabi magazine, where we also talk about a lot of Japan-related stuff. One of the very first articles that I had to write for Wasabi was an article about an artist that was, I think he was the official artist for the Japanese Sumo Association. And so he would use a special technique that was based on ukiyo-e woodblock prints to depict sumo wrestlers. And so in order to write this article, I had to spend a whole lot of time understanding how the heck sumo even works. Now, I had a very general understanding of sumo, super shallow at the time. But after doing all that research, I got a really solid understanding of the ranking system, kind of some of the rules, and how this guy would create his art and how it was connected to ukiyo-e woodblock prints. So it was just really interesting. And I learned tons about that. But in order to learn about that, I had to put tons of time into the research. So all this stuff kind of builds on each other, right? It all intersects, maybe not all of it, but a lot of it does, right? So like I was saying, I was doing research about sumo, but in order to do this article, I also had to understand ukiyo-e woodblock prints. And then later on, I had to write an article about ukiyo-e woodblock prints, but I already had a pretty solid understanding of how that worked. So that made things a lot easier, and I could focus on other aspects that I didn't know so much about. So all this stuff just compiles and compiles when you do anything for long enough, and this includes learning about a country and its language and its culture and its history. All this stuff just builds and reinforces what you already know. So this is all to say that there isn't really a shortcut. Really, it's just find things that interest you and, read books, consume content, watch movies. Anime is totally fine. Just understand what kind of content it is, who it's intended for, what kind of language is being used. Don't just blindly mimic everything you hear, but really put some thought into it, right? Like if a character says something that seems different from anything you saw in your textbook, think about why that might be, and then look it up, right? It's really important to look things up. And if you have a Japanese friend that you can talk to about this sort of stuff, that makes things so much easier. I have people in my life that I can ask about something that I've discovered, right? That confuses me. Some comedic thing, for example, some new reference that I missed. I can ask people and they'll explain it to me. And I've been doing this for years and years and years. And because of that, I can understand certain things in Japanese culture that maybe I would not have been able to otherwise. One great resource is Lang 8 or other similar, programs or apps or things like that. Lang 8 is a blogging program. So you write in your target language and then native speakers will correct your stuff. But the cool thing is that you can, for example, write about something that you want to learn more about and then ask questions. And then a lot of times the people that correct you will also answer your questions. One other really good thing that I think you should consider is doing something that you like in Japanese. For example, just a couple of months ago, I started learning how to play the ukulele. And being that I live in Hawaii, you would think that I would have been able to find somebody here in Hawaii to teach me. I tried. It did not work out for various reasons, scheduling, and just some people just didn't answer my calls or didn't get back in touch. I was not able to find somebody here in Hawaii, but I did find someone in Kyoto. So I have an ukulele teacher in Kyoto. And then twice a month, we meet over Zoom and we speak in Japanese about music stuff. And so I'm getting to practice talking about music. So if there's something that you like, maybe it's martial arts or whatever it is, you can use that to practice your Japanese. And in the process, you get better at Japanese, but you also learn about another aspect of Japanese culture. And this is just kind of like all a big positive feedback loop, right? You read a book about Japanese intelligence agencies, for example. You can go listen to my episode about that on Japan Station. But you read a book about that and you learn maybe 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 words. And then maybe those can be used as conversation starters with Japanese friends. And then that sparks a conversation. And then maybe you learn another word through that conversation. And it's just like an endless rabbit hole of stuff. And I've been doing this for the past 20 years or more. And yeah. And, there's people that are way better at it than me and that know far more about certain things than I do. But this is what has worked for me. And I still get tons of joy from reading books about Japan and learning things that I didn't know and having conversations with the kind of interesting people that I talk to on this podcast. So I still enjoy this. And if you foster that kind of genuine sense of curiosity, I think that's going to motivate you to just keep at it and keep at it. I think, Nicholas, you told me that you're particularly interested in Japanese literature and translation. So, read a lot of Japanese literature. Go beyond what you're supposed to do in the class, right? Just in your free time, find books. Just try, keep trying. These things, they seem like impossible, right? Being able to speak the Japanese language seemed impossible to me when I started. And yet, by persistence and sheer willpower and never giving up, I've gotten to the point where I can say pretty much anything I want to say, and I can consume just about any kind of content without too much trouble. And I can, just have fun and joke around in the language and do research in Japanese. Like when I think back to where I was in high school when I first started studying Japanese, like that makes me so happy that this is where I am in my life and that I get to do this kind of stuff. So hopefully you found something interesting in there. That's just the stuff that's worked for me. But I think that it can work for you. And ultimately, it's just time and effort, right? If you put in the effort and you keep at it, you are going to get better. You are going to learn more, and it's going to stick in your head, right? You are going to forget some stuff, but maybe that thing that you forgot is going to pop up in a different book that you're reading. And then now you just remembered it, and now it's really stuck in your head, right? So repetition, persistence, time, patience, and always staying humble, right? If my time in graduate school taught me anything, graduate school is like basically 2 years or more of teachers telling you you're wrong, explain yourself, justify what you just said. Why did you say that? That is the academic world. And it's great for encouraging critical thinking, and it's great for encouraging humility, but it's also great for encouraging confidence, because if you're able to explain yourself and you're able to justify what you're saying, then you can have confidence in yourself and in your knowledge in whatever it is that you're talking about. So that was a great experience, even though it was a very challenging and at times very stressful experience. My time in grad school really helped me grow as a person, and it is something that I would not change. So graduate school, as I said, it can be super stressful. It can be very difficult, but if you can make it through, and if you can find the kind of appropriate strategies to deal with the stress, and as long as you don't end up with an advisor that is, I guess I'll just say, toxic and not helpful, I think you can get a whole lot out of grad school. And by the way, I never wanted to go to grad school, but eventually I just thought that was the best option for me. And I am so glad that I did it. And my understanding of the way language works, and the way the Japanese language works in particular, it's just totally different. I am a completely different person, like in the way that I look at language, and specifically the Japanese language, because of my time there. And I am so happy that I did that. And because I did that, I was also able to make some wonderful, wonderful friends like Ryan, my co-host on Ichimon Japan. So I think I already said this, but that's basically it. In terms of recommending any kind of specific content, I can't think of anything specific right now. I've consumed everything from Haruki Murakami to anime to movies to books about the history of Japanese pregnancy and so much other stuff. What I can say is that so many of the books, just about every single book that I've mentioned or talked about on Japan Station is worth checking out. There's so many really, really good books there. It's totally fine to read stuff in English, but when you get to the point that you can read stuff in Japanese, then that's going to open so many more doors, and you are going to learn so much more about Japan and the Japanese language. And being able to kind of compare English and Japanese language sources, that is just huge. So be patient with yourself, but just be persistent, right? Always consume stuff. Try to do two things at the same time if you can, learn something while you're studying Japanese, and just keep at it, all right? Remember to have fun. Don't stress yourself out too much, but the more time and the more serious you are about learning about Japan and interacting with Japanese people and being able to use the language and understanding Japan and the way things work there and the culture and the history, the deeper you get, the better, the more enjoyable I think it will be, as long as you can keep that genuine sense of curiosity and you're able to rejoice in your little victories and successes. But again, stay humble. Okay, so I think I should end it there. And I'm sorry I can't give you any specific recommendations, but again, just whatever interests you, go down that rabbit hole and keep going deeper and deeper and deeper. All right. So so thank you for listening, and remember, go find your miniature pony.
Just do it!